The JonBenet Ramsey case has haunted the American imagination for nearly 3 decades. What began as a high-profile missing child call on Christmas morning 1996 turned into one of the most scrutinized and divisive unsolved crimes in recent memory. Over the years, competing narratives have emerged: a home invasion and intruder theory, and a darker hypothesis that places the crime inside the house. Recent re-examinations of interviews, physical evidence, and sealed records have made one thing plain to many observers: the story the public was given then does not settle the questions that remain today. This narrative collects key, contested pieces of the record, psychological interviews, physical artifacts, and later disclosures, and explains why a cluster of facts and behaviors has persuaded some that the family's public timeline and explanations deserve renewed, impartial scrutiny. What follows is not a prosecution, nor is it a definitive verdict. It is an attempt to lay out the evidence and the uncertainties in clear terms so listeners can judge for themselves. On January 8, 1997, 13 days after 6-year-old JonBenet was found dead, her 9-year-old brother was interviewed in a child-friendly setting by a clinician. The session's notes, reviewed later by multiple psychologists, describe behavior that experts called atypical for a child who had just lost a sibling to a violent death. When asked whether he missed his sister, the boy replied, without apparent distress, "I'm fine." Asked whether he felt safe in the home where the death had occurred, he said simply that he did. In a drawing exercise, he omitted the deceased sister entirely and placed his father far to the side and his mother as a very small figure. At one point the child said, "I have a secret," then refused to elaborate. 3 independent psychologists who later reviewed the materials described his presentation as emotionally disconnected and unusually composed for a traumatized child. Clinicians differ in how they interpret such behavior. Some view flat affect and dissociation as trauma responses. Others treat emotional detachment and omissions in family drawings as indications that deeper, potentially concealed dynamics exist. The interview remains a central and controversial piece of the puzzle precisely because it is clinical, contemporaneous, and resistant to a single, uncontested interpretation. Forensic detail that at first seems minor can become crucial. JonBenet's autopsy found fresh pineapple in her stomach consistent with ingestion within approximately 1 to 2 hours before death. Crime scene photos show a bowl of cut pineapple on the Ramseys' kitchen table. Later reporting and private investigative summaries have said that the boy's fingerprints were present on the bowl and the mother's on the spoon. If that account is accurate, it contradicts the family's public claim that the child had been carried straight upstairs and left to sleep. The pineapple evidence places at least one additional interaction downstairs during the night, a window of time that, if confirmed, undermines the official timeline offered early in the investigation. Whether those fingerprint attributions and digestion timeframes were handled, tested, and reported in a way that meets modern forensic standards is a matter for evidentiary review. The apparent mismatch between timeline and physical evidence is nevertheless one of the most frequently cited reasons for re-examination. 2 items are repeatedly raised by analysts who doubt the intruder theory: a heavy mag light photographed sitting upright on the kitchen counter, and a lengthy ransom note written on the family's notepad and pen demanding $118,000, an amount reported to match the father's year-end bonus. The flashlight photographed at the scene was reportedly wiped of identifiable prints, including the batteries, and then left conspicuously on the counter. Forensic experiments cited in later reviews showed that a maglite of that size could produce skull fracture patterns consistent with the autopsy. The ransom note, unusually long and stylistically distinctive, was written on household stationery. Handwriting analysts later identified similarities between the note and the mother's writing, though handwriting analysis is not universally conclusive. Taken together, critics argue, these facts point to staging or at least to deliberate evidence handling rather than the chaotic traces one would expect from an opportunistic, anonymous intruder. Defenders of the family's account stress that wiping an object does not prove intentional deception and that other explanations, contamination, investigative errors, and media pressures, complicate any straightforward reading. Several former household staff and school records later cited by private investigators describe troubling behavior by the boy in the months before the death. repeated feces smearing targeted at the younger child's room and belongings, episodes of violence, including reported strikes with objects such as a golf club, an obsession with knives and knot tying, and sexually suggestive play described by some witnesses as playing doctor. One longtime housekeeper told investigators she had at one point confiscated a Swiss Army knife and hidden it outside the younger child's door because she was worried. Child development experts say behaviors such as targeted feces smearing and weaponized roughness toward a younger sibling are important warning signs that require professional intervention. Records and therapist notes that private investigators claim to have reviewed reportedly document aggressive incidents and clinical concerns that were not, according to those same sources, fully pursued by the parents at the time. Those accounts are contested and many of the records remain sealed or were not presented at trial. But the converging descriptions from multiple staffers, if verified by independent review of original records, form an evidentiary web that helps explain why some investigators now consider intra-family scenarios plausible. Another critical pattern in the first hours and months after the death is behavioral. The immediate arrival of high-powered attorneys and PR advisors, the rapid sequestering of the surviving child with family friends, and later descriptions of the boy's police interviews as rehearsed. When the child was finally interviewed months later, he was reportedly flanked by lawyers and gave answers that investigators later described as scripted, precise denials, adult-sounding phrases, and patterned evasion when presented with physical evidence. To some observers, this looks like protection, an attempt to shelter a vulnerable child from trauma and sensational media attention. To others, it looks like narrative management intended to prevent disclosure of inconvenient facts. The legal reality complicates moral judgment. Juvenile confidentiality laws, sealed therapy records, and statutes governing minors' culpability mean that families and counsel often act to limit exposure in ways they argue are in the child's best interest. The passage of time has further complicated definitive answers. Evidence degrades, witnesses die, memories fade, and legal protections for minors preserve records from public view. Some private investigators report having obtained sealed school and psychiatric records showing a pattern of concern. Those investigators argue the newly reviewed material corroborates staff accounts and points to systemic family dysfunction. But gaps remain. DNA evidence referenced in the case has been described inconsistently. Some samples labeled unknown male could be contamination, transfer, or manufacturing traces. Chain of custody questions and early crime scene management decisions, multiple people moving through the house, the carrying of the body before the scene was secured, limit how conclusive later forensic retests can be. Legally, the combination of the boy's age at the time, sealed records, and protective juvenile statutes reduces the likelihood of a late prosecution even if new corroboration were to surface. For many observers, that creates a bitter divide between moral reckoning and legal consequence. Given the unresolved questions, several steps could help clarify the record without violating legal protections. An independent forensic review of retained physical evidence using current methods, conducted under transparent chain of custody oversight, would be a starting point. A court-supervised review of sealed psychiatric and school records by neutral child forensic experts, under protective orders that balance privacy with the public interest in historical clarity, could also illuminate disputed claims. Finally, a fresh, neutral audit of investigative decisions made in the crucial early hours and days, focusing on scene security, evidence preservation, and the sequencing of interviews, would address procedural questions that have long clouded public confidence. These are not simple remedies. They require resources, political will, and judicial orders. They also demand sensitivity to surviving family members and respect for confidentiality where appropriate. The documents and testimonials compiled in recent years do not resolve the case. They do, however, sharpen the questions. Why did the forensic indicators, pineapple digestion, fingerprints, the position and condition of objects, contradict the family's early timeline? Why was a heavy flashlight wiped and left in plain sight? Why did a child interviewed so soon after this trauma present in a way multiple clinicians found atypical? Why were therapy and school records sealed? And what do they contain that was so vigorously protected? Those are quasi-forensic questions whose answers carry moral and historical weight even if they do not end in a courtroom. Until neutral, transparent re-examination is possible, the JonBenet Ramsey case will remain both an emblem of high-profile investigative failure and a reminder of how fragile truth can be when power, privacy, and grief converge. The ethical imperative, to seek clarity while protecting children and respecting due process, remains. For a 6-year-old child who never had the chance to speak for herself, that imperative has a human urgency beyond speculation. If justice cannot be achieved in formal legal terms, at the very least the record should be honestly examined so history can reflect what is known, what is uncertain, and what questions continue to demand answers. The little girl who loved to perform, who dreamed of growing up to help other children, who smiled brightly in those pageant photos that became iconic images of innocence lost, deserves more than silence, more than sealed records, more than carefully crafted legal protections for those who may have failed her most profoundly. Until someone finds the courage to finally tell the complete truth about what happened that Christmas night, the case will remain a haunting symbol of how secrets, lies, and family loyalty can sometimes triumph over justice. But as long as people continue to ask questions, continue to examine the evidence, and continue to refuse to accept easy answers, her memory lives on in the pursuit of truth itself.